Ryan, thanks very much for coming on the show. I can tell you I'm very excited that you're here because I just recently found out about you.
Well, he's not really here.
Well,
Like somewhere else, but here.
I'm excited to have you within audible, not even within audible range. I'm excited to hear you.
Thank God for modern technology, because if this was like the 90s, imagine our phone bill. I think we would have had to kind of increase our budget.
Well, I can tell you, I remember just barely speaking overseas in the 90s, and that was expensive.
Yeah.
My parents were like, okay, here, you have 2 minutes.
Right. Forget about that next watch purchase. You got to talk to your grandparents.
Right.
Now, Ryan, you are the author of the Wrist Watch Handbook, and you will also not actually physically present right now. You don't have to give us your exact location, but you're somewhere in the United Kingdom, right?
You are correct. I am in the suburbs of the UK outside of London, where I moved relatively recently. I was living in New York for 5 years until April of this year. So I'm a dual citizen, so I've enjoyed the privileges of fast tracking through immigration in both countries.
So what compelled you to write this book?
I think it was like an overflow point, where my understanding and appreciation of wristwatches reached a point where, I was finding myself reading content and feeling a little dissatisfied by the depth of it. I wanted answers, simple answers, like what does the pusher do at 8 on this particular watch?
Right.
You'd be surprised by when you get a new watch release, there's a lot of copying and pasting going on. In fact, you wouldn't be surprised by this. I'm sure you're more than aware of it. There's a lot of copying and pasting going on. And sometimes some of the most basic attributes of a watch are not adequately described because I guess the writer is not looking at this thing end to end as a watch that needs to be described. They're talking about a dial update, or they may be making assumptions about what you already know, or I fear they may not have even thought about asking the question themselves.
They probably have not thought about asking the question themselves, and it's quite possible that they wouldn't understand the answer.
Yeah, I'm working around it more subtly and politely.
That's such an English way to do things.
Yeah. So that's the British version of me. So the American version, I guess, would say there's a lot of crap out there, and I got to a point where I was going on these little journeys individually to find out what the pusher at 8 o'clock did, and I was disappearing down rabbit holes, and I was retaining the information, and I just got to a point in my sort of 10 or so year journey of starting with what is this thing to really getting it, where I felt I can spot a watch from across the street. I've got great brand recognition and I'm understanding and appreciating what's going on underneath the dial. And I'm not getting a lot of content that's really satisfying me these days. So it's high time that I considered putting it onto paper. So I had the idea to write the book, but I don't have a huge library. So I went about a couple of weeks worth of market research, going to libraries, buying books, looking at colleagues' libraries. I was pretty convinced that these books are already out there. And it was just a case of me finding it and then, being disappointed to realize that someone had already done effectively what I wanted to do. But I found that there was nothing that really did what I had in mind, which was to marry visual watch pornography with highbrow content, with the technical stuff that satisfies, let's say, a new student watchmaker or a seasoned collector or someone who has a mind for engineering but is new to watches and really wants to get a really good understanding of how watches work. So I needed to write a technical book that was beautifully illustrated. So that was the sort of concept of my book. I'm going to treat the watch really objectively, sort of anatomically, and break down the chapters into 2 sections in the book. Section 1, how does a watch work? So split it up into power, transmission, distribution, regulation. And section 2, what are the complications? What are all the things that a watch can do? How is that made possible? You go through the first section and you get the concept of a basic watch. It's elaborated with the concepts of far from basic watches as well. So when we're talking about escapements, it's not long before we're talking about some of the more funky ones, natural escapement, tourbillon, multiple tourbillons, multi-axis escapements, all that good stuff. Then once you've got a really good sense of how does a watch work and what are the basic properties of a movement, you can then delve into the complications. So I've got chapters on astronomical complications, chiming complications, time zone complications, with a view to finding a pigeonhole for basically every single watch that I have seen in 10 years and a few more. That was the idea, and that book didn't exist. I had some good background information that I was able to research, whether it be online or in books, mining my own knowledge, having conversations with watchmakers, people in the industry. And it took about a year to write end to end. It was like a purging of everything that I had in my mind.
That sounds so incredibly enticing. I think the table here is a bit off kilter now. But
Okay, that got weird. That got weird. So Ryan, let's talk about you, the author. Let's talk about your history with watches. I mean, it does take a little bit of passion, I think, to take this much time and this much effort to create a book for a pretty niche market. How did you get into watches? And give us a brief background, if you have one, in terms of if you were in the industry or not, and just kind of give us an idea of where this kind of passion came from. Where did it stem from?
Sure. It was a personal journey more so than anything formal professionally or educationally. In fact, I came from a totally different world in that respect. My father wasn't particularly passionate about watches, certainly not about mechanical watches. The first watch that I received was a rubber sort of blue Casio, incredibly basic digital movement, those ubiquitous ones that just have two really thin pushers that you find in everything from like a Happy Meal watch to, I don't know, to something else. And I loved it. It felt amazing. The whole thing was just sheathed in this, what seemed to be like one piece of carved out rubber. And I loved it. And I lost it after about a week because I'm pretty useless with that sort of stuff when I was young. I was devastated and I had a real attachment to the thing. And then I didn't get another watch for years, and I didn't wear a watch throughout my 20s. I kind of just moved on from it. I wasn't particularly interested. And then when I was in my early 20s, and this is in early 2000s, I was with my girlfriend, who's my now wife, and she has a vintage Omega Constellation, and we were in Paris, and it felt like a great idea to go to the boutique there and look into picking up a new one for her for our engagement. And I got to the window of this boutique, and the DeVille Central Tourbillon skeleton watch was in rose gold with those black, I don't know, anodized, what it's sort of DLC treated plates that they have underneath it. And it had been wound up as well, so it was beating away. I don't think I'd seen a tourbillon before, and this is one hell of a tourbillon. And it was sitting there pulsing away. And so before we even walked in, I was like, what the hell is that? And I looked underneath it, and I think it said like 88,000 euros or something, which actually today I'm thinking, it's not a bad price actually. But
that's about half of what it is now.
So desensitized. I was shocked at the price. I was shocked by what I was seeing. And so we went in, and I was like, okay, my wife wants to see that Constellation. Can you bring it out and can she try it on? But can you get that watch from the window and just tell me everything you know about it? I don't understand how it works. I don't understand how it could be so expensive. I held it. I couldn't believe how heavy it was and how just spectacular it was. That was, for me, that's the moment that I became hooked on watches, and I made a commitment to myself that I'm going to understand how this thing works. I'm going to learn about why something like this exists. It's going to take me some time, but I'm going to get there. Around that time, I'd taken a new role. So professionally, I'm an accountant, I'm an auditor, I've got a law background, I've worked for different sort of multinational US and UK-based companies in media, in data. I worked for Christie's for a couple of years, and I'll talk about that in a second. I took a role in the internal audit team. I was recruited internally, and that role was like 65% travel. So every month I was spending 2 weeks in a different country. And it just became like the perfect thing for me to do with my spare time. I was buying magazines in airports, going into boutiques in airports. When I was away over weekends, I would plot, okay, I'm going to go to the Jaeger-LeCoultre boutique, and then I'm going to go straight across the street. They got Breguet. I'm going to go in there, and they've got And I'd just sort of disappear and go into all these places and ask a lot of questions and handle a lot of watches. That was the journey that I went down. And during that time, I found excellent online resources and forums and started reading more articles and the likes and got a couple of books. Actually, my first watch book that I bought was Watchmaking by George Daniels, which, I mean, talk about jumping in straight in the deep end.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I should tell you that I've read that thing cover to cover, and there are a couple of moments I'm thinking about. There's a particular moment about where to position the balance and how to calculate amplitude based on the various components, weights and sizes and whatnot. And there are some spectacularly complicated diagrams. And I think that was one of like 2 or 3 places where I did start to sort of haze over a bit. But I was obsessed with that book. I still go back to it every now and again when I want to refresh. So yeah, so I had some good books, some good resources. But then as I explained earlier, I got to a point where I started getting a bit fatigued. And during that time, I was starting to meet people, and I was actually starting to connect with people in the watch world. Until then it was like a secret thing that I was doing on my own, on an airplane or in a country where I didn't even speak the language. And then slowly but surely I was starting to say, hello, my name is Ryan and I am a watch enthusiast.
Welcome, Ryan.
And I'm not
Yes.
ashamed. It has been 10 years. So I took a job at Christie's in their legal department, working in internal audit. Really, really interesting couple of years. I was already in New York, and the role was based in New York. I was going to Rockefeller Center every day, every lunchtime, crossing the street and taking a look at $179 million Picassos and going upstairs into the watch department and harassing them regularly to show me all of their stock. But it's easy to think that auctioneers are these sort of slavering money monsters, but these guys are watch geeks, and especially when you're behind closed doors, they are just watch geeks, and they're in heaven in the job that they do. They're very welcoming to people coming in, and they like to show you what they got. So I was spending a lot of time handling watches now and meeting people that I'd read about and just getting a bit more access. And it was at that point, it was during my tenure there at Christie's that I thought, I'm going to do this. I'm going to write this. I also got to appreciate the vintage world because I came into this from purely, I like new and shiny things. I like novelty. I was the modern day watch marketer's dream. You put a fresh dial on it, have it untouched and all wrapped in plastic, and I'm going to pay premium retail price to get this thing. I needed that edge taken off, and being at Christie's was great. I got to appreciate the crazy world of vintage Rolex and Patek collecting, and I got to understand it enough to appreciate and I guess have some sense of what drives these guys to speak in reference numbers and obsess over small details that horologically are not particularly significant.
So this book has over 400 photos. It has over 90 manufacturers. Talk about the process of selecting the watches and why you chose certain watches over others.
Yeah, okay, so it's going to sound cheesy to say I didn't select the watch. The watches selected me. I don't think that makes sense, but what I'm trying to say is that I had a skeleton of a book in my mind. I had a sense of what it was going to look like. I knew 90% of the chapters that I needed to cover. And as I started fleshing the skeleton out into a little bit more detail, that was when I started saying, okay, this is where this watch comes in. This is where that watch comes in. When you are talking about a watch that tells you the strength of the tide, the field suddenly thins out and you have a choice. Do I choose the watch that I like the look of or the watch that I don't like the look of? In those circumstances, okay, I'll take a personal choice. But typically, when you look at like a watch that has a dive depth gauge in it, sure, you could pick from a handful of watches, but I wanted to go into the type of detail where I was saying, well, what kind of depth gauge does it have? How deep does it allow you to go? In what way is the depth read? And when you start to disaggregate like that, the list whittles down to like one watch. So I wrote the book and I ended up with 96 brands, about 400 watches, and I went about getting those exact watches. And so I ended up with exactly what I set out to get. I would say that there were probably 5 occasions where I switched watch from what I had in mind because maybe the brand said, look, we don't sell this anymore, but we sell this. And in some cases, I'd be like, well, I don't like that. So thanks, I'll take the image, but I'll end up actually switching it out and going with this brand. Putting together the images for this book, it was a huge endeavor. And I think when I was doing that, it became clear to me why this sort of book doesn't exist, because to write a book and to spend months writing a book and then to spend months getting the images for it, it's painful stuff. And I think my naivety was the thing that got me committed to writing this thing. And I'm glad I saw it through now. But beforehand, knowing quite how much time it was going to take, I remember the publisher said to me, one of his first questions when I gave him the pitch for the book, he was just like, where are you going to get the images from? I was just like, I'll talk to the brands. I'll talk to Christie's. And I was really chilled about it. But I ended up having 96 emails and telephone calls, different companies. And it took about 3 or 4 months, and I had this monstrous Excel spreadsheet that I was managing every morning, lunchtime, and evening to just kind of push along these different watch companies. And some of them were like, thanks for your email, really interested, here's the watch. Others were like, sounds okay, who are you again? What exactly are you going to be writing about? And a decent handful of them, it was just silence, and I'd have to push, and then I'd finally get hold of someone and they'd say, well, it needs to go to headquarters, and it would disappear into the void for a few weeks, and I'd have to push again. And, it was just a case of keeping the ball rolling. A small number of watch brands didn't play ball, but this is the thing. I mean, I'd written the book, I'd selected the watch, I refused to remove a watch that couldn't be replaced. And so the problem is a lot of the watches, if I'm using a watch that this is a power reserve indicator, then I'm good. If you won't give me your watch, I can think of hundreds of others that'll be just as good. But if I'm talking about a remontoire or I'm talking about a petit sonnerie, I'm going to start honing things down to a very specific list. And so there were 1 or 2 brands that they didn't know me. They have what I would call quite conservative approaches to marketing, or at least to sort of external projects. And so they just said, look, thanks for your interest, but we won't participate. So I then had to go and pull the images from third parties. That's where Christie's came in. And that was no shortcut either, because Christie's has a huge reputation and has multiple layers of diligence and intellectual property and privacy and whatnot. So I had to go through a lot of hoops to get some of those watches, but I did. And there were a few kind of, let's say, blog photographers or collectors that had taken certain photographs. And you can see it when you go through the book. You can suddenly see how there's a hell of a lot of like huge, high quality imagery. And then there's a couple there's like 1 or 2 wrist shots. And a couple of them have got slightly darker lighting. And you'll put 2 and 2 together and you'll realize, okay, that brand wasn't playing ball. And
Right.
if you're really paying attention, you'll put 2 and 2 and 2 together and you'll realize, that conglomerate wasn't playing ball.
Yes.
Surprise. I mean, look, at the end of the day, if they didn't play ball, you could always refer back to the watch enthusiasts visual playground, Instagram.
Yeah, I had never used Instagram, but I started my Instagram account when I launched the book. Because my brother, who's a graffiti artist, he was like, "You got to go on Instagram." And I was like, I don't know what to do. And he taught me how to hashtag and all of that good stuff. And I'm now obsessed with it. I don't even consider it part of marketing the book. I'm just as addicted as any other Instagram user now. I was going on watch forums and I was connecting with blog writers who would typically have written about 1 or 2 of these watches. But I got them. I got every watch that I wanted. To me, that was one of the biggest successes of writing the book. It was, when I finally had every image in, it was like scaling a mountain.
Ever since you said this earlier in the show, I've been thinking about the fact that we have something very much in common. Not identical, but very close. And that was when you talked about the Omega Centre Tourbillon.
Uh-huh.
And it just so happens that it wasn't a watch that got me into watches, because I'd been into watches a long time before that. but it was certainly the watch that actually reignited my flame.
Really?
It wasn't exactly the one. So there's a very similar variant. You were talking about the rose gold one with the DLC plates. So there is actually a variant on that coaxial center tourbillon, which is done where those plates are skeletonized and it's in platinum. And that one is an absolute, I don't think I've ever used the term before, but that is my grail watch, or one of them. That exact watch.
I used that actual one. I had a feeling that this watch might have had a similar effect on people. And so I've put the watch on, I think it's on page 8 of the book. It's one of the first watches that greet you as you make your way through it. And I did that intentionally because I wanted to have a go at how many other people are going to open that page and be like, what is this thing? And I think I have the platinum skeletonized version that you're talking about. It is stunning. I mean, it's unbelievable.
People may not know, and because you brought it up, it may be in your book, this, not the particular coaxial version that you saw, but the original Series 1 center tourbillon was actually the first center tourbillon in the world. It was done by Omega.
But it did not have a coaxial.
Well, no, when they released it, they had not released the coaxial yet.
So not interested.
Yeah, get out of here. Get out of here.
It actually, the Series 1 is gorgeous. And there are a lot of people that prefer it because it wasn't skeletonized.
I can see why it would be such an influential watch for very many different people. I mean, look at Beat Haldeman.
Oh, yeah.
His watches are essentially that watch, except with obviously a little bit of his own persona to them.
Yes.
I've actually got 3 of his watches in the book. I've got the Flying Resonance, I've got the Central Tourbillon, and then I've got the one that freaks people out. Do you know the one I'm talking about with the opaque dial?
I think I do. Yes, the one where you don't see anything other than just the opaque dial, which is, to me, one of the strangest exercises in horology ever. Something that you have to put to your ear to realize that it's actually working. I don't have much of a commentary on that watch because I just think it's a strange thing to do. Yeah. Kind of sort of in the same sense that I don't like many MB&Fs because they're very strange, they're quirky. But, there is a market for these and people like them and people buy them. And listen, to each their own, have fun with it.
Yeah, and you know what? He doesn't sell a lot of those and he gets disproportionate attention for those watches. I don't know if he's courted that attention or not, but I see it as performance art more than a watch.
Sure.
There's one that he does, which is a central tourbillon, doesn't tell the time, but has a minute repeater mechanism. That I can get my head around. You say, hey, I've got a central tourbillon in here. You can't see anything, but you slide the repeater slide and you can actually at least know what time it is. But then again, how the hell would you set the thing? So I don't think I don't think
that's a great question.
I don't think people buy that watch for any other reason than to just say, I have partaken in some sort of performance art or horological conceptual art, or even I'm a troll. And I like troll watches, by the way. I love Grand Seikos. In fact, my favorite troll watch is the Platinum 8-day spring drive.
You took the words out of my mouth.
Have you guys talked before? Have you guys hung out before?
I was even saying that I had never even known that. I found out about him when you said, hey, we're going to interview Wrist Watch Handbook. I was like, I better find out who this is.
Ryan, unfortunately, I'm going to kind of take Chase's position here and say that we're running out of time at On Time.
We are running out of time at On Time.
I was getting a little concerned because some of the things that Chase had coming out of his mouth, the tilting of the table and the...
We still haven't fixed that problem.
I'll be honest. When we were recording this show, I had a little bit of hesitation with asking Chase to ask a question or to make a statement just in case things went south really, really fast.
And they did, of course.
Guys, thank you. It was a pleasure. And I say that as a listener, by the way. I've been listening to your podcast for a while and I will continue to do so. And I would like to invite myself back on as well.
You've got our Google Calendar. Go ahead and write yourself in.
Yeah, exactly. Your invitation is accepted, I guess.
Yeah.
That's kind of weird to say.
Exactly. But yeah, let's leave it at that. So Ryan, before we sign off, let's go ahead and plug some of your information. Where can our listeners, A, get your book, B, find you on the interwebs, and C, whatever else you want to tell them?
You can buy my book on Amazon, on a number of other online watch sellers. You can buy it in bricks and mortar stores to the extent that they still exist. You can find out about my book, if you haven't found out enough already, on my website, which is wristwatchhandbook.com. Well, hang on a minute, it's thewristwatchhandbook.com. And I'm on Instagram as @wristwatchhandbook, where I go around the watch world carrying my book with me and taking wrist shots of watches from the book with the book in the background. It's become my new thing that I do.
This episode of On Time was recorded and engineered by Michael Senderovich with supervision by Tim Hatayama.
Team OTP is Ken Shute Production and Savada and Dune on social media.
Our theme song was composed and recorded by Hubie Wang.
For the entire OTP team, this is Mike.
And this is Chase. Thank you for listening to On Time.